Now you're probably wondering, what has faith got to do with your ability to live a healthy and happy life, right? Well, the short answer is lots. And this includes anything from our dietary preferences to our entire perception of life and how we choose to live it, which has a huge bearing on our well-being, particularly when it comes to stress. That is, when we live true to our faith, we reduce the amount of stress we experience in life. So, what is faith really? Well, if we look to the formal dictionary definition of faith, then we get a definition that reads complete trust or confidence in someone or something. And so that is interesting because it raises the question of what is that someone or something. We also get the definition, a strong belief in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. And this is also interesting as many of us associate faith with religion. In fact, about 85% of the world's population identify with a religion, which is huge. And that probably explains why the small country town which I grew up in had something like 6 churches, despite only having a few thousand people when we first shifted there. Having attended one of these churches, including being part of the Catholic community right through until finishing my high school education, has taught me much about faith from the perspective of religion. However, spirituality is something I have also come to know well. And what I have learnt from my own direct experience is that God is much bigger than we were ever taught about in our religious setting. And I'll talk more about this shortly. Don't get me wrong, I don't care if you're religious, believe in a higher power, or even if you're an atheist. It's not my place to tell you what to think or believe in. That's entirely up to you. But what I am here to do is to ensure that you live true to yourself when it comes to your faith, so that you can live your healthiest and happiest life. And so in order to help you do so, because our sense of faith is so heavily tied into spirituality and religion, it is essential that we have a sound understanding of what each of these are and how they differ to one another. And so I want to start by first defining what spirituality is. Spirituality can be hard to define, as it can mean one thing for one person, yet something else for another. In the narrow sense, spirituality concerns itself with matters of the spirit, which is the core essence of who you are. It's a part of us which is intangible or formless, yet it is the essence of who we are. The spirit's purpose, which is one and the same as your purpose, is to radiate its essence and awareness into every conscious moment you are alive here on earth, to grow, evolve, and experience life in all of its dimensions. Now, this is a process that requires time and deep introspection to get to know ourselves at a deep level, as well as to understand how we think about the world around us. A process that requires you to cultivate a deeper understanding and awareness of your spirit, of who you are and what you want and need to grow. A connection to the deepest part of your true or higher self. Now, before I go any further in discussing the nature of spirituality, it's important to break some possibly preconceived ideas about spirituality and its association to religious beliefs and faith. And generally, it's people who don't understand the true nature of spirituality who seem to often confuse the two. However, in reality, they are both different. Now, religion is based upon interpreting the words and actions of previous enlightened beings who once walked the earth. After all, they are simply a set of organized beliefs and proposed views organized as a type of doctrinal certainty. Spirituality, on the other hand, is unlike any religion whose beliefs are set in stone and institutionalized. Instead, the whole concept behind spirituality is that we should think for ourselves. It is based almost exclusively on a reflection of our own experiences and feelings in life, on what we feel to be true or right, as opposed to what we are told or led to believe is true or right. We all know that if we feel or experience something enough, then we simply know it to be true and right for ourselves. It was Einstein that once said, "The only source of knowledge is experience." And that's what spirituality is all about. Listening to the intuitive part of ourselves, which does a good job at deciphering what experiences are true and which ones are not. Unfortunately, this is not the case for many people today, who are just willing to follow what others believe instead of experiencing what is true for themselves. Instead of taking responsibility for their own lives and their own spiritual beliefs, they follow what others tell them or adopt religious beliefs formed thousands of years ago. And they do so while failing to see that such beliefs are simply metaphors or constructs that seek in their own limited and incomplete way to describe what we believe to be true, which has the potential to severely limit their own spiritual development. In other words, although we might be living true to the very doctrine of the religion we follow, because this doctrine is an organized set of beliefs created by man himself, it is very likely that by following these rules and beliefs, we are in fact not living true to the absolute faith which is available to us when we follow our own spirituality. And the same goes if you're an atheist. Sure, you can deny your spirituality and pretend that there is nothing else to this world other than your brain, but that is not living true when it comes to your faith either. I suggested earlier that I have discovered how God is much bigger than we have ever been taught. While developments in quantum physics over recent years has shown us what many of the spiritual gurus and leading thought thinkers, as well as some enlightened religious leaders, have spruiked across the ages. And that is that we all exist as part of the whole of creation. Whilst it is most typically referred to as God, it is actually impossible to define, as any attempt to do so is too self-limiting in nature. In quantum physics, it is often referred to as the universal field of energy and is defined as a transparent energy or spirit which binds all things in and out of this world. It permeates all matter, both living and non-living. And humans are connected to this field via their personal energy field. In fact, everything in the universe, including all of creation, is made up of energy. The frequency at which energy vibrates at determines its physical manifestation and form. And the fastest vibrating energy is source energy or love, which is the conscious part of who we are. And so we are born into physicality as an extension of this energy. in order to experience life and enjoy all that it has to offer. But what happens is that we forget this connection to this source or the field, and as a result always struggle to find real meaning and purpose in life, regardless of what we have. In fact, this connection to the field is so important that without it, it's only a matter of time before we inevitably experience a crisis of meaning and even feel lost. In place of this connection, our ego mind, which is responsible for rational or logical thought processing, only perceives to be real what it can make sense of. And that's anything which is tangible or form-based. As such, it begins to build a false sense of identity in such a subtle way that most of us are not even aware. And so, in light of this, the only way to become fully connected to the field or source again is by getting in touch with your true, authentic, or higher self. And this occurs through lots of self-inquiry, including meditation, contemplation, and other forms of self-development work, including listening to our heart instead of outside influences. And so, with enough work and sheer desire to know the truth, it is possible to undo the ego of its old beliefs, negative patterns, and attachments, to more fully realize the multi-dimensional nature and infinite potential that is the true self, and with it connect to the field or source. In other words, we need to raise our consciousness enough to become one with all that is. And the more we listen to the intuition of the heart, the more we experience the universe directly in this moment. Reality the way it really is. Now, this is why my mum would always say to me growing up that there is no religion higher than truth. You know what? She was 100% right. And this truth resides in your heart. As we do this, we also become whole and fully present, and we find the unconditional love that we have been subconsciously searching for our entire lives. And so, given that this is the way connection to the divine primarily occurs, which should be the true purpose of any spiritual or religious-based faith, it is imperative to keep this in consideration when I outline what some of the characteristics of living true in terms of your faith are, so that you can ensure that you are doing so. Okay, so the first thing you want to do when it comes to living true in your faith is to ensure that your faith is based upon your own experience and not only doctrine. Edgar Cayce once said, meditation is listening to God, whilst prayer is talking to God. The reality is that we all have the ability to connect directly to the field, source, God, call it what you will, on our own, simply by getting in touch with our true self and listening to our intuition and living from our heart. With this being the case, why then would we blindly follow in the words of a doctrine written thousands of years ago by man, which is very likely being tainted? It's like using second-hand information versus going directly to the source and getting first-hand information. So please, before you follow any organized beliefs, take the time to slow down and connect to your true self and listen to what it is saying to you. But with enough practice in connecting to your true self, you will become more confident and learn to trust the information you're receiving more. Don't get me wrong, There is nothing wrong with following certain religious and spiritual scriptures. But just ensure to take all of the wisdom you absorb with a grain of salt, rather than using it as the primary guidance on how best to live your life. In a similar way, the next thing to do is to ensure that your faith sits well with your own values and beliefs without resistance. So often, the very faith we find ourselves adopting is a result of us being influenced from others. Whether it be your parents who introduced you to a certain religion when you were growing up, or if you attended a religious school, or any other source of influence. There is nothing wrong with this, if this is the case. And generally speaking, I agree with so much of what the world's religions preach. In fact, as my mum also always taught us, a strand of truth runs through every religion. At the same time, however, there is much that I don't agree with either. And this is because my own connection to my true self and the field have taught me otherwise, as have scientific developments. So an important part of living true when it comes to your faith is to ensure that the beliefs that you are following in your pursuit for a more meaningful life are in fact your own, and do in fact sit well with your own values. If not, then take from it what resonates as truth and disregard the rest. But do so honestly. In a similar way, we need to ensure that our religious convictions have not been mistakenly reinforced through your spiritual experiences in life. What do I mean by this? Well, all of us have had spiritual experiences throughout our lives. You know, whether it's some kind of miracle that happened, a message received, synchronicity, an aha moment, a paranormal experience, or whatever else. What so often happens when we have such experiences is that instead of seeing this for what it is, a direct interaction with the field or source, we can mistakenly attribute it to what we know or what we have been influenced by in our life. For example, if you grew up as a Catholic, then you might label your spiritual experience as an interaction with Jesus. Or if you're Muslim, then you might believe that Allah has spoken to you. Obviously, we do this to try and make sense of our experience. However, in doing so, we need to be careful that we don't dismiss the true source and meaning of the experience itself, which is most often than not a connection and interaction to the field via our true self, which is available to us at all times. Next, it is important to determine if your faith is based upon love and compassion. The reality is that we live in a benevolent universe where love is the most powerful force in existence. It's the very thing that life emerges from, and the glue that holds it all together. Therefore, any school of thought that is not based upon love has very likely been tainted by man. This is why it is essential that we live from our hearts and only consider adopting teachings which are based on truth. In other words, love and compassion as opposed to lies, hate, and insensitivity. For example, if your religion teaches an eye for an eye rather than to forgive, then it is clearly not based on love. A big component of this also includes ensuring that your faith is inclusive rather than exclusive or judgmental to others' beliefs. Ask most Christians and they will say that Jesus is the one and only Saviour. Whilst if you ask a Muslim, they will tell you that you should only follow the teachings of Allah, including the Prophet Muhammad. Ask a Hindu and it's Hinduism. And so it goes on. And each will often argue between themselves to which master is the true one and which one is not. And this is part of the reason why countless wars have been waged in the past. The need to be right. Gandhi once said, "It is a travesty of true religion to consider one's own religion as superior and others as inferior." And he said this because doing so only leads to further division. In contrast, anyone who is truly in touch with their true self and their spirituality are willing to absorb wisdom teachings wherever they can find them. A yogi master, a Japanese healer, or a Buddhist monk. It really doesn't matter where they absorb it from, as long as it feels true for them. In a similar way, it is also important to ensure that your faith is flexible in its fundamental beliefs and teachings when it comes to accommodating new scientific discoveries. In fact, it was the Dalai Lama who said, "What we need today are universal values based not on faith, but on scientific findings, common experience and common sense." One such religious example that has never made sense to me is the belief that we are all born into original sin. How is it that a newborn baby can automatically be born into original sin if it has just come into this world and hasn't done anything wrong? And so this is important because science is how the world works, which is in many ways reality itself. Obviously, in saying that, we also need to be wary that just like religion, much of the science has also been tainted, the truth withheld, or even ignored because of money, greed, and power. So in light of this, we always need to intuit the scientific findings through our intuition, including using our discernment to what is real and what is not. And we also need to be mindful that science is yet to catch up with many of the fundamental teachings of religion and spirituality. And as such, cannot explain everything. With that said, however, quantum physics is continuing to reinforce what we intuit to be real, that God is much bigger than we've ever been told. The same goes for any belief systems that discourage you to connect to your true self through way of self-development, or anything which dismisses all New Age practices as misguided, part of the occult, and even evil. Don't get me wrong, there are countless spiritual practices which may not be benevolent and trustworthy, which is why you always have to decipher the truth for yourself. But the reality is that unless we get in touch with our true self, then we will never find true peace and happiness in life. Which takes me on to the last point that I want to make when it comes to living true in terms of your faith. And that is to ensure that the faith you have leaves you feeling empowered rather than disempowered. Because many religions encourage one to look externally to God instead of within, thus creating a separation from the real divine truth, including one's own true self. And as we saw earlier, we are made in the very image of God and connected to this energy through our true self. This means that we are the conscious co-creators of our own lives. That is, our own thoughts, feelings, and desires manifest into physicality. And as such, we are the ones that are primarily responsible for our life and how it turns out. Sure, you can get additional help from God and the field. God helps anyone who helps themselves and who asks for assistance. However, this is secondary, and the problem with many organized belief systems, and particularly religion, is that they often encourage you to surrender everything over to God. And as such, anything that does or doesn't happen in your life is a result of God's will. Well, this is one disempowering belief. Sure, I get it. It's important to be in alignment with God, especially in terms of trusting the process, which is often referred to as higher order. However, I think we need to be really careful here that we don't push too much responsibility onto God for the outcomes of our life. And that's because at the end of the day, we are more in charge of our lives than any supreme being is. So to suggest that God is primarily responsible for your life and how it turns out is nothing more than a cop-out. All of the greatest spiritual and religious teachers were here to simply remind us that we too have the same power as them. They wouldn't want to be immortalized because doing that leaves you powerless to change your own situation. I want to wrap it up by reiterating that having a sense of faith is so important in life. But first and foremost, we need to ensure that we connect directly to the source of creation by getting in touch with our true self and actively working towards learning more about who we are as a spiritual being. Then and only then would I encourage you to study the scriptures and to decipher what you believe to be real or not, if you so desire. Because it is only by doing so that you can truly stand in your light, stand in your truth, and stand in your power. So, are you living true when it comes to your faith? Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to learn more about the other essential attributes of staying in your best shape. And until next time, watch what you chew, do what you need to do, and always live true.